Happiness left my life the day you were born. It hurt every time Mark heard those words, but he kept hoping that one day she would love him. Mark's hand shook as he tied the rope to the beam above, just like he had seen in the movies. His heart was racing, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop now. He thought about all the times he had wished for his mother to love him, to hold him, to kiss him goodnight. But those wishes had never come true. Today, though, he could make her happy in a different way. With the rope around his neck, Mark closed his eyes. He thought about his letter, about how Mama Mark would finally be happy. And maybe, just maybe, she would miss him a little bit too. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that she would finally get what she always wanted. Mark took a deep breath, and then there was silence. The house. My name is Adugo, and you're watching the African Tales channel by Adugo. Before we dive into today's story, please kindly click on that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be notified whenever I upload a new video. Now, let's get into the story. Mark's life had never been easy. Every day, he tried to make Mama Mark smile, but it never seemed to work. She would always say the same thing, over and over again. Happiness left my life the day you were born. It hurt every time Mark heard those words, but he kept hoping that one day she would love him. Today was different. Today, Mark wanted to give his mother the best birthday gift ever. He had thought about it for a long time, and he finally knew what to do. He carefully wrote a letter, his small hand trembling as he held the pen. He didn't know how many big words, but he knew how to write what was in his heart. When he finished the letter, he placed it on his bed, right where Mama Mark would find it. Then he looked around his room one last time. The old worn-out toys that he had outgrown, the torn school books with doodles on the pages, and the small photo of him and his father that he kept hidden under his pillow. His father, who left when he was just a baby because of him, or so his mother always said. Mark's heart felt heavy, but he also felt a strange kind of peace. He knew this was the right thing to do. If he wasn't around anymore, maybe Mama Mark would finally be happy. Maybe she would even start smiling again. He took a deep breath and opened the door to his room, stepping out into the hallway. The house was so quiet. It felt like the walls were holding their breath, waiting. Mark walked slowly, his bare feet making soft sounds on the cold floor. He made his way to the small cupboard under the stairs where his mother kept the old dusty rope. Mark's hand shook as he tied the rope to the beam above, just like he had seen in the movies. His heart was racing, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop now. He thought about all the times he had wished for his mother to love him, to hold him, to kiss him goodnight. But those wishes had never come true. Today, though, he could make her happy in a different way. With the rope around his neck, Mark closed his eyes. He thought about his letter, about how Mama Mark would finally be happy. And maybe, just maybe, she would miss him a little bit too. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that she would finally get what she always wanted. Mark took a deep breath, and then there was silence. The house, the world, everything went still. A few hours later, Mama Mark came home. She was tired, like always, her face twisted in a frown. As she walked through the hallway, she noticed something strange. The house was too quiet, even for them. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she made her way upstairs. When she opened the door to Mark's room, she saw the letter on his bed. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. her eyes scanning the words written in her son's small, shaky handwriting. As she read, her heart began to pound, and the cold fear gripped her. She dropped the letter and ran down the stairs, her feet stumbling as she called out for Mark. But there was no answer, and then she saw it, the small figure hanging from the beam, the rope cutting into his neck, his eyes closed as if he were sleeping. Mama Mark screamed, a sound so full of pain and regret that it echoed through the empty house. She ran to him, trying to lift his lifeless body, but it was too late. Her boy, her little Mark, was gone. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, her mind spinning. All the things she had said to him, all the anger, the blame, it had led to this. She had pushed him away and now he was gone. And the letter, that terrible, heart-wrenching letter, was the last thing he had left behind. But then, as she heard him, something strange happened. The air in the room seemed to shift, a cold breeze brushing against her skin. Mama Mark looked around, her heart racing, and she thought she saw a shadow move across the wall. A figure, small and thin, just like Mark. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Mark was still here, in this house, with her, but not in the way she had hoped. No, this was something different, something dark. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Mama Mark knew that this was only the beginning of a nightmare that she could never escape. Mark had given her the birthday gift she always wanted, but now she would have to live with it forever. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen in the house. Mama Mark would hear whispers in the middle of the night, soft voices that sounded like Mark calling her name. Doors would close and open on their own, and she could feel a presence following her wherever she went. She tried to ignore it, to tell herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew the truth. Mark was still here, and he wasn't going to leave her alone. Not now, not ever. Every time she looked at the letter, she felt a cold dread wash over her. The words he had written, the love and pain mixed together, haunted her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All she could think about was her son, the little boy she had pushed away, and the terrible mistake she had made. And as the days turned into weeks, Mama Mark began to realize that she was trapped in this house with the ghost of her son, with the guilt and the regret that would never let her go. But what she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. There were secrets in this house, dark secrets that had been hidden for years. And now, with Mark's death, those secrets were starting to come to the surface. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and Mama Mark began to feel a fear like she had never known before, because she was starting to understand that Mark wasn't alone. There was something else in the house, something that had been waiting, watching, and now it was ready to strike. Mama Mark could feel it, lurking in the corners of her mind, in the dark spaces of the house. It was a darkness that she had tried to ignore, but now it was impossible to escape. And as the days went on, she knew that something terrible was about to happen, something that would change everything forever. The darkness was closing in and there was no way out, no way to escape the nightmare that had begun on her birthday. The day her son gave her the gift she had always wanted, the gift that would haunt her for the rest of her life. And as the whispers grew louder and the shadows moved closer, Mama Mark knew that the worst was yet to come. Mama Mark could hardly tell where the days ended and the nights began. The house, once a place of silent resentment, had transformed into a maze of shadows and echoes that seemed to have a life of their own. Every corner seemed to harbor a secret, and every shadow seemed to move when she wasn't looking. The whispers became more insistent. like a soft chorus just out of reach. At first, it was just Mark's voice calling her name, sometimes sobbing, sometimes laughing, but always tinged with a sadness that sent chills down her spine. But soon, there were other voices, darker, angrier, voices that didn't sound like Mark at all. One night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying in vain to fall asleep, she heard it again, the soft creak of a door opening downstairs. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This had become a nightly occurrence, but tonight something felt different. The air was colder and the whispers had grown louder, almost like a chant. For a moment, she considered staying in bed, pulling the covers over her head and waiting for it to pass. But something stronger, curiosity, fear, or perhaps guilt, drew her out of bed. She slipped on her robe and quietly opened the door, peering into the dark hallway. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the whisper seemed to guide her, pulling her down the stairs into the heart of the house. The living room was pitch black, but as she entered, the temperature seemed to drop even further. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as she strained to see through the darkness. And then she saw it, Mark's small figure, standing in the corner of the room, his face hidden in the shadows. "Mark," she called out again, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a hesitant step forward, but he didn't move. His silence was unnerving, and as she moved closer, she noticed something strange. There was another figure behind him, taller, its shape indistinct but menacing. Mama Mark froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure seemed to be looming over Mark, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. "Who's there?" she managed to choke out, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer, but Mark finally lifted his head. His eyes, which had always been full of sadness, were now empty, hollow. And when he spoke, his voice was different, colder, as if something else was speaking through him. "You shouldn't have done it, Mama," he said softly. "You shouldn't have wished me away." Tears welled up in Mama Mark's eyes. She wanted to reach out to him, to pull him into her arms, but something in the room kept her back. A force that felt like it was holding her in place. "I am sorry, Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry." But Mark shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "It's too late, Mama. They are here now." "Who?" Mama Mark asked, fear gripping her heart. "Who's here?" Before Mark could answer, the figure behind him began to move. It stepped out of the shadows, revealing a face twisted with anger and malice. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its eyes glowed with a dark, unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a cruel grin. "We've been waiting, Mama Mark," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Waiting for this moment. You let us in when you let him die." The room seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing against her from all sides. She could barely breathe, her mind racing as she tried to understand what was happening. "What do you want?" she cried, her voice breaking with terror. The figure stepped closer, towering over her. "We want what was promised," it whispered, its breath cold against her skin. "A soul for a soul. Mark's death has opened the door, and now we are free." Mama Mark shook her head, backing away until she hit the wall. "No, this isn't happening. This can't be real." But it was real. The figure's grin widened as it reached out a hand, cold and skeletal towards her. You wished for this, Mama Mark, and now you will pay the price. Before she could react, the room plunged into complete darkness, the figure's laughter echoing in her ears. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped, alone with the weight of her guilt crushing her from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness lifted. She was back in her room, sitting on her bed, her hands clutching the sheets. The house was silent again, but the terror lingered, heavy in the air. Mama Mark knew now that she was dealing with something far beyond her understanding. Something dark, something evil, and it was all because of her. She had wanted Mark gone, had wished for it every day of his short life. And now that he was gone, she was paying the price. But it wasn't just Mark she had to worry about anymore. The darkness had taken root in the house, and it wasn't going to leave her alone. Not until it had taken everything. In the days that followed, the haunting grew worse. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and turning in the corners of her vision. The whispers were constant now, filling the house with a low, insistent murmur that made it impossible for Mama Mark to think clearly. She barely slept, barely ate. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mark's face. His sad, hollow eyes staring back at her. But it wasn't just his face she saw anymore. There were others now. Twisted, ghostly figures that seemed to lurk just out of reach, waiting for the moment when they could strike. And all the while, the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive, feeding off her fear and guilt. The walls seemed to close in around her, the windows darkened as if the sun itself had abandoned the house. Mama Mark knew she couldn't go on like this. She had to find a way to stop it, to end the nightmare before it consumed her completely. But she didn't know where to start, didn't know how to fight something she couldn't see, couldn't touch. And then, one night, as she sat alone in the dark, the answer came to her. The old family Bible, hidden away in the attic, covered in dust. Her mother had always said that it held the answers to all of life's problems, that it was a source of strength and protection. Mama Mark hadn't opened that Bible in years, not since her mother had passed away. But now, as the darkness closed in around her, she felt a desperate need to find it, to see if it could help her. With trembling hands, she made her way up to the attic, the old wooden stairs creaking under her weight. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of mothballs lingering in the air. She hadn't been up here in years, and as she had searched through the piles of old boxes and forgotten memories, she felt a strange sense of dread. Finally, she found it, the old leather-bound Bible, worn and faded with age. She opened it carefully, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything that could help her. And then she found it, a passage that seemed to jump out at her, the words glowing faintly in the dim light. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Mama Mark clutched the Bible to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know if it would work, didn't know if was enough to drive the darkness away, but it was all she had left, the only thing standing between her and the nightmare that had taken over her life. As she made her way back down to the living room, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. Maybe there was still a chance to find peace, to free herself from the darkness that had taken root in her home. But as she opened the door to the living room, her hope was shattered. Mark was standing there in the middle of the room, his eyes filled with tears. "Mama, why did you leave me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with sorrow. Before she could answer, the shadows in the room began to move, swirling around Mark like a dark, menacing storm. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the darkness itself was angry, desperate to keep its hold on her. Mama Mark clutched the Bible tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mark, I am here now," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I am here. I am not going to let them take you." But Mark shook his head, his expression full of pain. "It's too late, Mama. They are already here." The shadows surged forward, swallowing Mark in their darkness. Mama Mark screamed, reaching out for him, but he was gone, consumed by the very thing she had brought into the house. And as the darkness closed in around her, she realized the terrible truth. The darkness that enveloped the house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a living thing that thrived on fear and despair. Mama Mark stood frozen, clutching the old Bible as the shadows swirled around her, their whispers growing into a cacophony of haunting voices. She had hoped that the Bible would offer salvation, a way to drive away the darkness and save her son. But now, the shadows seemed to mock her efforts, their whispers growing louder and more frantic, echoing her deepest fears and regrets. The living room felt like a trap, the walls closing in as the shadows writhed and twisted, forming shapes that were both familiar and terrifying. Mama Mark could see ghostly figures emerging from the darkness, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. They reached out to her with spectral hands, their whispers blending into a relentless chant that seemed to invade her very soul.